The desert road had no lights. It cut through nothing. Miles of flat scrubland in every direction, the kind of empty that pressed in on a person from all sides and made the world feel very small and very far from help. The air was cold and sharp at that hour, carrying the smell of dry brush and cracked earth and the specific silence that only existed in places where human beings were not supposed to be alone. Nothing moved on that road. Nothing breathed, until the boy appeared. He came out of the tree line on the right shoulder like something the darkness had ejected, stumbling onto the asphalt and catching himself on bloodied hands before pushing back to his feet with a desperation that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with love. He was 9 years old, small for his age, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans that were torn at both knees. His feet were bare. The soles were bleeding where the gravel and broken brush had opened them up, and the dark prints he left on the asphalt looked like evidence of something terrible. He didn't look down at his feet. He didn't look anywhere except straight ahead. He ran. His arms pumped. His chest heaved. His face was a ruin of tears and dirt and raw terror, the face of a child whose entire world had come apart at a seam that should never have existed in the first place. He had been running for a long time. Long enough that his legs were starting to lose the argument with his weight. Long enough that the sounds he made were no longer quite crying and not quite breathing, and somewhere in between both. He ran until he saw the headlights. 3 of them, cutting through the desert dark in a tight formation. 3 black armored SUVs moving with the unhurried authority of vehicles that did not concern themselves with speed limits or attention. They consumed both lanes without apology, the lead vehicle slightly ahead of the other 2, all 3 running silent except for the low, controlled thunder of serious engines. The boy did not slow down. He ran faster. He planted himself in the center of the road with both arms thrown above his head and every last piece of air in his lungs forcing itself out at once. Stop. Please. Somebody stop. They hung my MOM on the tree. Please. The lead SUV's brakes engaged with smooth hydraulic certainty. It stopped 15 feet from the boy. The other 2 vehicles halted in formation behind it without a sound. All 3 sets of headlights held the boy in place like a spotlight, his shadow thrown long and jagged across the asphalt behind him. For 4 seconds, nothing happened. The boy stood with his arms still raised, his chest heaving, his bare bleeding feet on the center line of an empty desert road. Then the front door of the lead vehicle opened. The man who stepped out moved with the particular economy of someone who had not rushed in a very long time because he had not needed to. He was broad and straight and somewhere in his mid-40s, dressed in a dark suit with no tie, a black shirt beneath it, the collar open at the throat. His face was angular and composed, the kind of face that had processed enough of the world's violence that it had stopped reacting to new information and started simply receiving it. Dark eyes moved across the scene with the speed and precision of a camera shutter. A scar ran from his left jawline toward his ear, silver pale against the dark skin around it, old enough to have a history. His name was Marco Vasquez. In certain rooms in certain cities, that name was said quietly and only once. 2 doors opened behind him in synchronized silence. 2 men stepped out and moved into flanking positions around Marco with the automatic precision of people who had rehearsed this without ever being asked to. Dark suits, white shirts, hands resting with deliberate looseness near the places where concealed things lived. These were not staff. They were an extension of Marco's authority given human shape. The boy's legs finally surrendered. He dropped his knees on the asphalt 6 feet from Marco's polished shoes, his hands slapping the road, his whole body shaking with a trembling that started in his core and moved outward until there was nothing left of him that wasn't shaking. He lifted his face and the headlights caught it fully, and what was there was not the face of a frightened child. It was the face of a child who had already seen the worst thing. "They hung my mom on a tree," he gasped, the words fracturing as they came out. "They tied her hands and put a rope on her and hung her up and she was moving but she wasn't waking up and I couldn't reach her. I tried, I couldn't get her down. Please, you have to help her, please. She's still there, please." Marco looked down at the boy without moving. He did not kneel. He did not reach out. He observed with those dark, still eyes that missed nothing, reading the evidence the way other men read text. The boy's bleeding feet. The rope burn on his right wrist, thin and raw, where someone had tied him and he had pulled free. The way his breathing came in ragged, uneven pulls that spoke of a child who had been running for a very long time across very rough ground in the dark. None of this was performance. One of Marco's men took a step forward. Marco raised one hand, without looking at him. The man stopped. The boy's sobs filled the desert silence, broken and enormous, the sound of something that had been held together by forward motion and was now finally allowed to fall apart. "Please," he whispered. She was still moving. She was still there. "Please." Marco tilted his head slightly. He was performing the same rapid calculation he performed in boardrooms and negotiations and moments far darker than this. The child's injuries were real. The rope burn on his wrist was real. The specific quality of the terror in his eyes was the kind that could not be faked because it required having actually experienced the thing that produced it. "Where?" Marco said. One word. A command that was also a promise. The boy raised a shaking arm and pointed toward the tree line he had burst from. "In there. There's a path. Not far. Maybe I ran 5 minutes. There's a big tree. A dead tree with white bark. They tied her up by her wrists and her feet weren't touching the ground, and I tried to reach her, but I couldn't, and they saw me, and one of them hit me and told me to run, and told me to tell my dad what happened, and..." His voice broke open completely. "I don't have a dad. It's just us. Please." Marco's jaw tightened by 1 degree. He looked at the 2 men beside him. Nothing was exchanged but a glance. The rear SUV's engine shut off. Doors opened and closed. 2 more men emerged from the vehicles, moving into tactical formation around Marco with their hands now resting openly near weapons that were no longer entirely concealed. Marco looked back at the boy. "Stand up." The child tried. Made it halfway. His legs gave out. Marco caught him by the arm before he hit the asphalt, not gently and not roughly, with the precise neutral grip of a man who did not do anything carelessly. He steadied the boy and held him until the trembling legs found enough purchase to stay upright. "Your name?" "Tomás." "How old are you, Tomás?" "9. How far did you run?" "I don't know. I just ran. I didn't stop." Marco looked at the boy's feet. The damage there told him that it had been a significant distance across rough ground in the dark. He made a decision without announcing it. He lifted Tomás without ceremony, settling the child against his side with one arm beneath him. The boy weighed almost nothing. Tomás wrapped both arms around Marco's neck and pressed his face into the man's shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite relief and contained traces of both.
"Hold on," Marco said.
"Don't let go." Not comfort. Instruction. Tomás held on. Marco turned toward the tree line and moved. His men fell into formation around him as they entered the trees, 1 ahead, 2 flanking, weapons now drawn, eyes reading every shadow with the sharp attention of people who had walked into dark places before and understood what dark places could contain. The temperature dropped as the desert scrub gave way to denser growth. The light from the road disappeared almost immediately behind them. Flashlight beams cut the dark in precise angles. Tomás directed with one hand, pointing left, then straight, then left again, his voice reduced to a whisper now that the trees had swallowed them. The forest pressed close. Branches reached across the narrow path like hands trying to slow their progress. The ground was uneven, root-crossed, the kind of terrain that punished inattention. Marco's men moved through it in silence, their flashlights sweeping in coordinated arcs, covering the angles that needed covering. "There," Tomás breathed. "Through there." The trees opened. The clearing was small and roughly circular, the kind of space that felt deliberate even though nothing about it was. Moonlight fell through the gap in the canopy above in a pale broken column that lit the center of the clearing with the cold, indifferent light of something that did not care what it illuminated. In the center of that light stood the tree. It was large and old, its white bark pale as bone in the moonlight, its branches spreading wide and heavy. And from one of those branches, hanging by ropes that bound her wrists above her head, her feet a full foot clear of the ground, was a woman. She was perhaps 30 years old, dark hair falling across her face. a yellow dress that had been torn at the shoulder. Her head hung forward, her chin to her chest, her body still.
Too still.
Tomás made a sound that had no name. Marco's expression did not change, but his grip on the boy tightened and his other hand moved to his weapon, and he said one word to the man in front of him. Check her. The man who reached her first was named Gale, former military, hands that had administered both violence and care in roughly equal measure across 15 years. He pressed 2 fingers against the woman's neck, searching beneath the cold skin for the thing that mattered most. His shoulders dropped half an inch. She's alive, he said, his voice tight. Pulse is weak. She needs to come down right now. Marco shifted Tomás in his arms, turning the boy's face deliberately away from the sight of his mother hanging from that branch. He placed one hand over the back of the boy's head and held it gently against his own shoulder. Don't look, he said quietly. It was not comfort. It was protection. Tomás buried his face deeper, and his small body shook with sobs that had used up all their sound. Marco's second man, Cruz, a compact and efficient former intelligence operative, had already produced a tactical knife and was moving to the base of the tree. He climbed with quick practice certainty, reaching the branch in seconds, positioning himself above the rope. The third man, Reyes, stationed himself directly beneath the woman with both arms raised, preparing to receive her weight the instant the rope was cut. He planted his feet and steadied himself with the focused patience of someone who had done harder things. Ready, Cruz called down.
Go, Marco said.
The rope parted with a sound like a held breath releasing. Reyes caught her with a gentleness that did not match the size of his hands, lowering her immediately to the ground, supporting her head with the practiced care of someone who understood exactly what the neck and spine needed in this moment. Gale was beside her before she finished settling, his hands moving from her wrists to her pulse to her breathing in rapid, expert sequence. Rope burns are deep, Gale reported, his fingers examining the damage at her wrists where the rope had bitten into skin. She's been up there for a while. Circulation impaired. Possible shoulder damage from the suspension. She's in shock. He looked up at Marco. She needs real medical attention.
She'll have it, Marco said.
Stabilize her. He looked at the surrounding clearing. His flashlight moved across the ground with deliberate attention, reading the story that footprints and disturbed earth told to people who knew how to listen. Multiple boot prints. At least 5 sets, the treads of serious work boots worn by men who expected rough terrain. They circled the tree in the chaotic, overlapping geometry of a group that had been here for a while. The prints led in from the northeast, and most of them led back out the same way. Marco followed the outbound trail with his flashlight until the beam ran out of clearing. They were not far. He could feel it in the air the way you felt weather before it arrived. He looked at Tomás. The boy had turned slightly, watching his mother on the ground with an expression of tortured hope, Gale's hands moving over her with practiced certainty. Tomás. The boy looked at him. Your mother's name? Sophia. Sophia is alive because you ran. You understand that. Not a question. A fact delivered cleanly, because the boy needed it as much as he needed air. Tomás swallowed hard. His eyes went back to his mother. My men are going to take care of her, Marco continued, his voice dropping so only the boy could hear. I need you to go with them. Stay with her. Do not leave her side. Tomás's arms tightened around Marco's neck. Where are you going? Marco was quiet for exactly 1 moment. To find the men who did this. Something moved across the boy's face. A cold, clear understanding that no 9-year-old should have possessed, but that survival had placed there without asking permission. He looked at Marco with eyes that had aged a decade in a single night. There were 5 of them, Tomás said. His voice had changed. Younger than before and older at the same time. One had a tattoo on his neck. A bird. One of them smelled like cigarettes and something sweet. One of them was very tall and wore a red cap. The one who hit me had a ring on his right hand. I felt it. He touched his own cheekbone where the bruise was already darkening. And the one in charge, they called him Señor Bravo. He told the others to make sure she was high enough that her feet couldn't touch the ground. Marco looked at the boy for a long moment. He had just been handed everything he needed. Good, Marco said simply. That was brave. He set Tomás down and guided him to Reyes, who had finished positioning Sofia and was now spreading a thermal blanket over her with careful hands. Stay with your mother, Marco said. Reyes will keep you both safe. If anyone comes who isn't one of us. I'll handle it, Reyes said, his hand moving to his hip with quiet finality. Tomás sat down beside his mother and took her hand in both of his and pressed it against his chest, and the look on his face was the look of a child who had nothing left to offer except presence and love, and was offering both completely and without reservation. Marco stood. He looked at Cruz, already reading the northeast trail with his flashlight. At Gale, risen from beside Sofia, watching Marco with the focused patience of a man waiting for a signal. No words were necessary. The three men moved toward the northeast trail, and the trees swallowed them like they had never existed. The camp was a quarter-mile into the scrubland. It had been a working cattle operation once, the remains of a low stone structure still standing at the center of a cleared area, a rusted metal roof over half of it, the rest open to the sky. A truck was parked to the left, red, heavy-duty, the kind that did not attract attention on rural roads. A fire burned low in a ring of stones near the structure's entrance. Voices drifted on the cold air. Relaxed voices. The voices of men who believed themselves entirely finished with the evening's work. Marco observed it for 4 minutes from the tree lean before he moved. 5 men visible. The configuration matched exactly what Tomás had described. The tall one in the red cap sat on the truck's tailgate. The one with the bird tattoo on his neck stood near the fire, warming his hands. 2 others were inside the structure, their shadows moving against the firelight. The 5th, the one Tomás had named Señor Bravo, stood to the right of the entrance with a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, rapid tone that carried the energy of a man reporting completed work to someone who had commissioned it. Marco stepped out of the tree lean. He walked directly toward the fire with the unhurried certainty of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet, Cruz on his left, Gale on his right, both weapons visible now. Not raised. Simply present. The way the sky was present. The man with the bird tattoo saw them first. He had enough time to stand up straight before Marco stopped 10 feet from the fire. The voices inside the structure went quiet. The shadows stopped moving. The tall man on the truck's tailgate lowered his beer bottle slowly and carefully, the way you lowered things when your hands needed to be free. Señor Bravo lowered his phone. He was perhaps 50, thick through the chest, with a face that had spent a long time learning to look at other people as objects. He assessed Marco with the flat professional calculation of a man who trafficked in intimidation and recognized when he was looking at its source. Vasquez, he said. Not a question. Recognition arriving cold and certain. Bravo, Marco replied. The name of the man who had commissioned the job was already known to Marco. Had been known before he left the tree lean. Cruz had made 2 calls during the walk through the scrub, quiet and efficient, and by the time they reached the camp's edge, Marco understood exactly who had ordered Sofia hung from that tree, and exactly why. Her name was Sofia Medina. She worked as a bookkeeper for a distribution company on the eastern side of the valley. 3 weeks ago, conducting routine account reconciliation, she had discovered discrepancies that pointed clearly toward money laundering passing through the company's books. She had made one mistake. She had asked her supervisor about the numbers directly rather than going quietly to someone who could protect her. Her supervisor worked for Bravo. Bravo worked for a man named Alcazar, who operated one of the valley's more profitable and visible enterprises through a network of legitimate-appearing businesses. Sofia had been strung from a tree in the desert as a message to anyone else in the company who might have similar questions. Her 9-year-old son had been tied to a fence post 50 yards away and forced to watch. Marco had processed all of this during the walk and arrived with everything he needed to know. You're a long way from the city, Bravo said. His eyes moved to Cruz and Gale, calculating odds. This isn't your territory. The woman you hung from that tree is in my care now, Marco said. His voice carried no emotion. It carried something worse than emotion. Complete certainty. Her son stopped my convoy on the highway. Something fractured in Bravo's composure. The boy was supposed to run home. He was supposed to. He ran to me instead,
Marco said.
Which means you made a choice tonight that placed Sofia Medina and her son under my protection. Everything that follows from that choice belongs to you. Bravo's jaw worked. He glanced at his men, taking inventory of what he had and what he was facing. 5 versus 3. In a normal calculation, those numbers had meaning. This was not a normal calculation, and everyone in the clearing understood that. Alcazar won't stand for this, Bravo said. You move on me, you move on his operation. You know what that means. I spoke with Alcazar 40 minutes ago, Marco said. Silence dropped over the camp like something solid. Bravo stared. He sends his regards, Marco continued, and his complete indifference to whatever happens to you and your men tonight. He was not informed of the specifics of this particular operation. He was very interested to learn about them. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. He has reconsidered his association with you effective immediately. The tall man on the tailgate set down his beer bottle and stood up very slowly with his hands open at his sides. The 2 men inside the structure appeared in the entrance and did not move. The man with the bird tattoo on his neck took 1 step backward toward the darkness. Cruz's weapon tracked him without hurry. The man stopped. Bravo's face had traveled through several colors and arrived at something between gray and white. The predator's confidence was gone. What remained was the face of a man who had spent a long career making other people understand consequences and was now understanding one himself.
What do you want? Bravo said.
Everything, Marco replied. The full structure of Alcazar's operation. Every business it runs through. Every person it employs. Every arrangement it has with anyone who looks the other way in this valley. He let the weight of that settle. And the name of every person who is in that clearing tonight. And if I give you all of that? Marco looked at him steadily. Then the conversation continues. Bravo understood what that meant. He understood what the alternative was. He sat down on the low stone wall at the structure's entrance, and he started talking. He talked for a long time. The safe house sat behind a wall of old mesquite trees on a private road that appeared on no publicly available map. It was a long, low building with thick walls and small windows, the kind of architecture that said nothing from the outside and meant everything on the inside. The medical suite occupied the eastern wing, clean and fully equipped and staffed by people who asked no questions and kept every answer given to them locked in absolute silence. Sofia Medina was transferred from the SUV to a proper bed within 60 seconds of their arrival. The doctor, a woman named Castillo with silver-streaked hair and the composed authority of someone who had catalogued every category of harm the human body could sustain, began her assessment while the stretcher was still moving. Her hands were efficient and without drama, moving from pulse to wounds to temperature to respiration with the speed of someone who understood that time had already been lost and could not be wasted further. Tomás walked beside the stretcher, with one hand resting on his mother's arm the entire way. Not gripping, just resting. The way you kept a hand on something you had almost lost and were not yet ready to trust the world to keep safe without your contact. Marco watched from the doorway of the medical suite as Castillo worked. He watched Tomás settle into the chair beside the bed without being asked, pulling his legs up, positioning himself so that his mother's face was the first thing he would see and the last thing he would see regardless of which direction he looked. The boy had not spoken in 30 minutes. He had simply been present, with the focused and total presence of a child who had decided that presence itself was a form of prayer. Castillo emerged after 20 minutes. Deep rope lacerations on both wrists, she reported to Marco, her voice low and precise. Shoulder joint trauma from the suspension, significant but not permanent with proper treatment. She was up there for close to 3 hours by my estimate. Exposure, shock, blood loss from the wrist wounds. She met his eyes. She will make a full recovery. 2 weeks of rest and monitoring. No permanent damage. Marco nodded once. The boy. Concussion risk from the blow to his face, but I don't believe it's serious. Lacerations on both feet that need cleaning and dressing. He is otherwise physically unhurt. Castillo paused. He won't leave her side. I know. That's good for her. Familiar voices. Familiar presence. It helps them come back when they've gone somewhere their body sent them to survive. Marco looked through the doorway at Tomás. The boy had fallen asleep in the chair with his head resting on the edge of his mother's bed, one small hand still wrapped around hers, his face finally slack and unguarded, finally 9 years old again. He should always look 9 years old. That was the thing. He should never have had to look like anything else. Marco turned and walked down the corridor to where Cruz was waiting with a tablet and everything Bravo had given them. The list was long. The names were specific. The architecture of Alcazar's invisible empire was detailed and navigable and could be dismantled with the right pressure applied in the right sequence. Cruz spread the information across the table and Marco looked at it with the focused patience of someone who understood that this kind of work required precision above speed. "We start with the accounting layer," Marco said. "Cut the money first. Everything else follows." Cruz nodded. "And Alcazar himself. I'll speak with him again tomorrow. Tonight he already understands that his exposure is total. He'll cooperate to protect what remains of his legitimate interests." Marco looked at the list. The men from the clearing. All of them confirmed. Cruz nodded again. "The young one," Marco said. "The one who answered every question without hesitation. Barely 20. No prior record. Recruited through his older brother, who was already inside Bravo's operation." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Put him on a bus. Give him a number to call and instructions on how to use it. Give him a chance." Cruz raised an eyebrow by exactly 1 millimeter. "He reminded me of someone," Marco said simply, and that was all. Cruz did not ask who. Sophia woke at dawn. The light came through the room's single window in thin gold bars, falling across the white blankets and the clean bandages on her wrists and the face of her son asleep in the chair beside her. She lay still for a long moment, absorbing the ceiling, the smell of clean linen, the sound of Tomás breathing slowly and deeply in the way that only children who had exhausted themselves completely could breathe. Her shoulders ached deeply. Her wrists burned beneath the bandages. Her throat was raw. Her memory of the night before arrived in fragments. The office, the drive home, the lights in the rearview mirror that she had foolishly slowed for, the hands that had pulled her from the car, the rope, the tree, the branch above her. Tomás screaming her name from somewhere in the dark until the sound got farther away and then stopped. She turned her head and found a man sitting quietly near the window. Not sleeping. Not on his phone. Simply present in the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting in rooms where important things were being decided. "Mrs. Medina," Marco said. She looked at him. At the composed dark face, the open collar, the scar along his jaw. She looked at the room around her, the clean walls, the medical equipment, the profound distance from a tree in the desert dark. "My son," she said. "Beside you. Asleep. He hasn't left that chair since we arrived." Sophia turned her head and saw Tomás and made a sound that was not a word and did not need to be. Her bandaged hand moved toward him. Found his arm. Rested there. The boy stirred. His eyes opened. For 1 second, just one, the terror from the night before crossed his face again, the reflex of a child waking back into a nightmare that was still close enough to touch. Then he saw her. His face collapsed into something that had no name in any language, all the fear and the running and the praying and the holding together releasing at once in a single expression that was relief and grief and love compressed into the face of a 9-year-old boy who had done everything a 9-year-old boy could do, and then found someone to do the rest. "Mama," he whispered. "I'm here," Sophia said. "I'm here. I'm here." Marco stood and moved to the doorway and gave them the room. He stood in the corridor with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the floor and thought about his sister, who had been 7 years old when men had come to their home, and Marco had been 12 and too small and too powerless to stop anything that happened that night. He thought about the specific shape of that failure, the way it had hollowed him out and then slowly, over the years, filled him with something harder and colder and more capable. He thought about the fact that he had spent 30 years building a kind of power that the 12-year-old version of himself would have given everything to possess. He thought about a boy throwing himself in front of 3 armored SUVs on a desert highway in the dark. running toward danger because running away meant leaving his mother in a tree. Behind him, through the closed door, he could hear Sophia and Tomás speaking to each other in low, rapid voices, the compressed, urgent language of people reassuring each other across a distance they had almost not survived. Castillo appeared at the end of the corridor. "She's asking for you," she said. Marco turned and walked back to the doorway. Sophia looked at him from the bed. Her face was bruised and pale and bandaged and absolutely, undeniably alive. Tomás sat on the edge of the mattress beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers, her arm around him, both of them holding the kind of stillness that came after something enormous had passed. "Tomás told me," Sophia said. "He told me he stopped your cars. He told me you came into the trees." Her voice was hoarse and careful. "He told me you carried him." Marco said nothing.
"Why?" she said.
It was the only question that mattered in rooms like this one, asked by people in beds like this one, after nights like the one they had just survived. Marco looked at the boy sitting beside his mother, at the way Tomás's shoulder was pressed against hers, as if continuous contact was the only thing that made the world navigable. At the boy's feet, now clean and carefully bandaged. At the face that finally looked 9 years old again. "I had a sister," Marco said. He did not say more than that. Sophia looked at him for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I." A silence settled between them, the kind that did not require filling. Outside, the first real morning light was arriving over the desert, clean and without memory. The days that followed moved at the pace of healing, which was slower than anyone wanted and faster than anyone expected. Sophia recovered with the determined focus of a woman who had a son to get back to and a life to rebuild, and absolutely no intention of allowing either project to be delayed any longer than necessary. She submitted to Castillo's instructions with the discipline of someone who understood that impatience now meant weakness later. She slept when she was told to sleep and ate when she was told to eat, and within 2 days she was sitting upright without assistance and asking sharp, specific questions about everything she had missed. Tomás did not leave the safe house. He explored it instead, with the methodical curiosity of a child who processed anxiety through investigation. He cataloged its rooms, its corridors, its hidden and unhidden things. He asked Cruz questions about every object he encountered, and Cruz, to everyone's surprise, answered most of them with a patience that suggested he had experience with children or simply appreciated a mind that wanted to understand how things worked. They played cards in the evenings. Tomás was good, better than he had any right to be. "He counts the cards," Cruz told Marco on the 3rd evening, without accusation. Almost with admiration. "So did I at his age," Marco said. On the 4th morning, Tomás appeared in the doorway of the room where Marco was working and stood there with the particular expression of a child who had decided to say something they had been organizing for a while. Marco looked up. "She cries at night," Tomás said. "My mom. After she thinks I'm asleep. She cries and then she stops herself, and I can hear her stopping herself. And that's the worst part. The stopping." Marco set down what he was holding. "She's ashamed," Tomás continued. "She told me she shouldn't have asked about the numbers. She said she should have known better. She said she made a bad decision and put us both in danger." His jaw tightened. "I told her that wasn't true. That she didn't do anything wrong. But I'm 9. She doesn't believe me the way she'd believe someone else." Marco looked at the boy. "She did nothing wrong," Marco said. "She found something that should not have existed and asked a question about it, which is what an honest person does. The men who use that question to justify what they did to her, that is entirely their fault. All of it. No portion of it belongs to her." Tomás absorbed this. "Will you tell her that?" "I already did." "Tell her again." Marco studied the boy for a moment. 9 years old, standing in a doorway in the safe house of a man he had met 4 days ago on a dark highway, advocating for his mother with the steadiness of someone twice his age. "I will," Marco said. Tomás nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back down the corridor. That evening, Marco spent 15 minutes with Sophia. He said what needed to be said directly, and without softening it, the way he delivered all information that mattered. He told her that the discoveries she had made demonstrated integrity. that the response to that integrity by the men who employed her was a reflection of their character and not hers. That her son had run barefoot through a dark desert for 30 minutes to save her life, and that child deserved a mother who believed she was worth saving. Sophia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the window for a long time. He ran 30 minutes, she said finally. At minimum. Probably longer. She was quiet for another moment. Barefoot. Yes. Sophia pressed her bandaged wrists together in her lap and breathed slowly. Something in her expression shifted. The shame that had been sitting behind her eyes since she woke moved aside by increments and let something else take its place.
Not peace. Not yet.
But the beginning of the decision to refuse shame, which was its own kind of courage.
Thank you, she said.
Marco nodded and left before gratitude could become something more complicated. 3 days after the night in the desert, Marco sat across a restaurant table from Edmundo Alcazar. The restaurant was expensive and quiet, and the kind of public that provided safety for both parties. Alcazar was 60, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed, with the polished surface of a man who had spent decades presenting one face to the world while operating an entirely different one behind it. He had built his invisible empire carefully and patiently and had, until recently, believed it to be essentially untouchable. He understood now that he had been wrong. Marco placed a folder on the table between them. Alcazar looked at it without touching it. How complete is that? Complete enough, Marco said. Alcazar was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary late-morning pace, entirely indifferent to what was being decided in this corner of this restaurant.
What do you want? Alcazar said.
3 things, Marco replied. First, Sophia Medina and her son are removed entirely from any consideration by anyone connected to your operation. Now and permanently. If anything happens to either of them, anything at all, the contents of that folder become available to people who will use them in ways you will not recover from. Alcazar nodded slowly. And second, the businesses you've been running protection through are released. Immediately. All of them. The owners receive written confirmation that their obligation is concluded. No replacement structure. No successor operation.
Done.
Alcazar's jaw tightened. That represents significant. Third, Marco said, as if Alcazar hadn't spoken. There are 11 other employees at the distribution company who may have seen what Sophia saw. They are to receive immediate confirmation in writing that their employment continues without consequence and that no questions will be asked or answered about the period in question. They are civilians. They stay that way. Alcazar looked at the folder. Then at Marco. He had been in difficult rooms before, across difficult tables, but there was something in the quality of Marco Vasquez's attention that made difficult feel like a category that no longer applied. You're asking me to dismantle a significant portion of. I'm telling you what happens next, Marco said. The asking is already done. A long silence. A waiter appeared and disappeared without leaving anything. Bravo, Alcazar said. Is no longer a concern to either of us. Another silence, this one carrying the weight of a man calculating what he had left and what fighting cost and arriving at the only arithmetic that made sense. All right, Alcazar said.
Good.
Marco stood. He left the folder on the table. He did not shake Alcazar's hand. He walked out into the ordinary morning and made 2 calls on the drive back, confirming that the pressure points he had identified in Alcazar's structure were being addressed simultaneously by the people he trusted to address them. Cutting the money first, then the relationships, then the infrastructure. By the following morning, the distribution company's general manager had received a memo from the ownership group stating that a full internal audit had been completed, all accounting irregularities had been resolved, and all staff were confirmed in their positions with no further review required. Sophia received a copy by secure message. She read it once, set her phone down, and looked out the window of the room where she was healing for a very long time. Then she looked at Tomás. Monday, she said. We start over on Monday. On the 5th morning, Marco found Tomás in the garden before the household was properly awake. The boy sat on the low wall at the garden's edge with a notebook in his lap, pencil moving. He was drawing something with the focused, deliberate attention he brought to card games and questions, and everything else he decided deserved his full effort. Marco sat down on the wall beside him, without announcing himself. Tomás didn't look up. She slept through the night, he said, without stopping herself.
Good.
Cruz taught me a new game last night. I beat him twice. He let you. Tomás looked up. He said you'd say that. Something close to amusement moved through Marco's expression. Tomás looked back at his notebook. The pencil kept moving. Are we leaving today? Tomorrow morning. The new apartment is ready. Your school enrollment is confirmed for Monday. Tomás was quiet for a moment. Will it be safe? Yes. How do you know? Because I am very good at making sure of things. Tomás accepted this with the pragmatic directness of a child who had learned that certain answers were complete even if they didn't explain themselves. I made something, Tomás said. He tore the page from the notebook carefully and held it out. Marco took it. It was a drawing in pencil, slightly smudged at the edges from the heel of a careful hand, but precise where it needed to be precise. A desert highway. 3 black SUVs in formation. A small figure in the center of the road with both arms thrown above his head. A larger figure stepping out of the lead vehicle, walking toward the small one. The small figure's feet were bare. Beneath it, in block letters that had been written and erased and rewritten until they were exactly right. The night someone came. Marco looked at the drawing for a long time. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the small figure with its arms raised on a dark road, and at the larger figure walking toward it, and at the bare feet that the boy had remembered to include, because they were part of the truth of it. Thank you, Tomás, he said. Tomás shrugged in the way that children shrugged when they had done something they actually cared about and didn't want it to show too much. I wanted you to have something to remember it. I won't forget it. People say that. I mean it differently. Tomás looked at him with the steady assessing gaze he had been deploying since the highway, trying to understand what kind of man sat beside him, trying to find the right category for someone who existed outside the ones he knew. Are you a good man? Tomás asked. The same question he had asked that first night, returning now without the desperation that had driven it before, asked calmly, from a position of genuine curiosity. Marco folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked at the garden and the mesquite trees at its edge and the early morning sky above them going from gray to gold. I am a man who does what he believes is necessary, he said. Sometimes that means doing things that good men would not do. But I hope, on the nights when it matters, I am pointed in the right direction. Tomás thought about this seriously, the way he thought about everything seriously. You came into the trees, the boy said finally. When you didn't have to. Marco looked at him.
So did you, he said.
Tomás was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to the garden, and the pencil in his hand moved again, starting something new on the fresh page, and the morning light grew steadily around them. The desert highway looked entirely ordinary in the morning light. Flat asphalt. Scrubland on both sides stretching to low hills that were purple in the early haze. A sky so blue and clean it seemed to have no memory of being dark. A crow sitting on the guardrail at the shoulder, watching the road with the patient indifference of a creature that had seen everything and judged none of it. Marco stood beside his vehicle at the exact spot where it had all begun. He had not planned to stop here. Cruz had taken the highway on automatic pilot, the route back to the city, and Marco had said nothing until they reached the mile marker and then said quietly, "Stop here for a minute." Cruz had stopped. Now Marco stood at the shoulder and looked at the place on the asphalt where a boy's bare feet had left dark prints that the night had erased before anyone could see them. Where 3 SUVs had halted in their lanes because a 9-year-old had thrown himself into their headlights and screamed. There was nothing to mark it. No evidence. Just road and sky and scrubland running out in every direction. The tree line stood where it had always stood, dark and ordinary in the morning light. Somewhere in there was a clearing with a white bark tree. Nature was already reclaiming it. The disturbed earth would settle. The rope marks on the branch would be covered by new growth. The forest kept its own records and shared them with no one. Marco thought about the morning that Sofia and Tomás had left. He had not been there for the departure as planned. He had told Cruz to handle the transfer. He had not planned to be present for goodbyes because goodbyes created attachments and attachments created complications, and he had spent a long time building a life where neither of those things were affordable. But he had been standing in the corridor when they came out, and Tomás had seen him and stopped, and Marco had stopped, and there had been a moment where neither of them spoke, and it was not awkward. It was simply true. Sophia had looked at him the way people looked at something they were committing to memory. "We'll be all right," she had said. Not a question. A declaration. "Yes," Marco had said. "You will." Tomás had raised his hand in the kind of wave that was also a salute, the gesture of a boy who had learned something about dignity from a very particular set of circumstances. Marco had raised his hand in return. The vehicle had pulled away, and he had watched it until it turned onto the road and disappeared into the ordinary brightness of a weekday morning. That had been 3 hours ago. Now he stood on the highway where it had started.
His phone buzzed.
A message from Cruz's number. A photograph taken 20 minutes ago. Sophia and Tomás standing in front of a building in morning light, both of them squinting into the sun. Sophia's arm around her son's shoulders. Tomás holding up a piece of paper with letters on it. Marco enlarged the image. The paper said, "New home, day 1. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He thought about his sister, about the 12-year-old boy who had not been able to stop anything and had spent 30 years becoming someone who could, about the specific weight of power used correctly, which was different from every other kind of weight he carried. Lighter in one way, heavier in another. He thought about Tomás running barefoot down a dark desert highway toward 3 sets of headlights because his mother was in a tree and every second mattered, and there was nothing left to do but run toward the thing that was the most frightening. He thought about stepping out of that lead vehicle. The simplest decision of the night. The one that everything else had followed from. He saved the photograph. He put his phone away. He stood for one more moment on the road where it had all happened, with the crow watching from the guardrail and the morning going gold around him and the tree line keeping its silence across the scrub. Then he got in the vehicle. "Now," he said. Cruz pulled out smoothly, and the desert road opened ahead of them, straight and flat and perfectly ordinary in the morning light. The scrubland fell away. The city appeared on the horizon, glittering and complex and full of the work that never paused for anything as irregular as mercy. But as the desert gave way to pavement and the highway fed into the approach roads and the city came up around them, Marco kept his hand against the inside pocket of his jacket, against the folded piece of notebook paper inside it. The small figure with its arms raised. The larger figure walking toward it. The night someone came. His sister had been 7 years old. No one had come. But a 9-year-old boy with bleeding feet and rope burns on his wrist had run toward danger on a dark highway because love was stronger than fear and his mother needed him. And a man who could have simply kept driving had instead stepped out of his car. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything. The desert held its silence behind them as the city swallowed them, and the morning light hardened into full day, and somewhere 3 hours north Sofia Medina was opening the door of a new apartment, and her son was running ahead of her into new rooms, and the world was turning with its usual indifference to everything that mattered. But this had happened. And the road remembered. The road always remembered. Thank you for staying until the very last word of the very last chapter. That means 8 n equals everything. If you're ready for another story that will stay with you long after it ends, tap the next video on your screen right now. I have something extraordinary waiting for you tomorrow. And before you go, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read every single one.
See you tomorrow.